And now, according to the IMF, there's a shift in economic ties between China and Africa. This as the East Asian nation veers from resource-intensive practices, threatening Africa's resource exporting markets. Undoubtedly, this calls for a shift in economic relationship between the nation and the continent. And David Monyae, who's director of the Center for Africa-China Studies at the University of Johannesburg, joins us with his analysis of the necessary pivot. David, a pleasure. Good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon to you and to all listeners.
Well, David, I think you would have heard in my intro, up until now, the relationship between China and Africa has been largely based on China importing commodities and Africa exporting them. But of course, we know right now that the Chinese economy is at a bit of an inflection point.
Indeed, I think there's a lot of soul searching on the African continent, that there is a need to change the focus and to do much more beneficiations, ensure that you add value to the raw material. I think that is central for Africa, as well as opening up and trade among Africans themselves through the newly signed free trade area, opening up all the bottlenecks in terms of trade, movement of people and goods. Is quite critical, and China is our number one, but I think we need to diversify and have all other regions and ensure that we attract Chinese in other areas, including their own markets that they're opening to us, or the challenges that we just don't have the necessary goods that are required in China.
I must ask you about, the structure of that Chinese economy, David. Of course, with that changing from being one that is resource intensive, one is possibly capital expenditure intensive, to being one that is consumption driven, is it possible at all that that might also create a market for Africans to export different things to the Chinese economy?
Well, indeed, I think what we have in China, it's a massive middle class. It's a middle class that is larger than the US entire population, and it's also growing. However, this particular market is also shifting in terms of taste. The trend is that fine and trendy goods, finished goods, that is, are required. It's a market that is too demanding, and the competition is quite stiff. We're competing with Americans, we're competing with the European Union and Asian countries. Latin America is coming up, and therefore there is a need for Africa to really change and ensure that we also produce goods that are in demand in China as we compete with others.
Another interesting development, I think, here is what we're seeing with Africa's ability to export, green metals and these strategic metals that are said for transitioning. What's interesting, Dave, is that China seems to really be on top of their transitioning. They're already on top of, for instance, electric vehicle manufacturing. They're really able to manufacture them cheaper than their global counterparts there. And I'm wondering if that means that when we are speaking about who to partner with these green metals, China may not be top of our list.
Oh, indeed. I think what we also have noticed in recent days, the speech by President Ramaphosa, nation of recently, I think he mentioned that going forward, we'll be working with our neighbors. I think there is a need for Africa to realize that we have strategic critical minerals as they are called. And therefore, I think we need to unite with the DRC, to unite with Zambia and a number of other countries, including Zimbabwe, to ensure that we have common position on this critical mineral. Everyone from the entire world is coming on the African continent for these minerals. And business must not be as business as usual. I think there is a need to ensure, firstly, that we get maximum benefits out of this critical mineral. These are minerals that are going to drive our future economy, particularly as we enter the fourth industrial revolution. Therefore, I think we have a golden opportunity to ensure that those who come and invest in our countries do not just take raw material. We need to ensure we have necessary beneficiation mechanisms, and we can cooperate among ourselves so that we also ensure that much of the resources remain on the continent to improve the lives of our people.
I must also ask you about that, David, the issue of African economies possibly can't afford to spend another few decades also being too resource intensive. It can't be our story for another, tens of years. And I'm wondering, when we speak of issues of beneficiation, then we still think of things like electricity, just basic infrastructure here. It's also very clear that to compete in this new world order, if we must, we're going to have to get way more ducks in a row than we currently have.
Indeed, I think what we have, if you look at Southern Africa itself, we have the Inga Dam. It has been sitting for decades unresolved. I think Southern Africa, African continent, should and must resolve the Inga Dam, ensure that we realize the power, hydropower that is from Inga Dam. And we need to work on other issues. For instance, next 10, 15 years, Johannesburg will have huge problem with water. We need to pipe water from Inga Dam, and the planning should start now. But far beyond all these energy and water, I think we also need to look at the regulatory framework. We also need to ensure that our laws, we need to ensure that we have regulatory framework that is friendly to business, that makes sense. We deal with corruption issues and a number of other bottlenecks that really hinder development on our continent.
With that said, as we look to our relationship with China, David, but even with all global superpowers emerging, we are seeing some form of a new scramble for Africa and for African relationships here. What are some of the things that we should be clear on in terms of our ability to renegotiate terms of engagement that are definitely more favorable this time around?
I think the first thing is the unity among Africans. The sooner we realize that as South Africa, 61 million people, we cannot really fairly trade with China with 1.4 billion people. It makes sense if we combine the force with SADC, we combine force with the African continent with 1.3, 1.4 billion Africans. I think we'll have fair trade outcomes, trade agreements with China, EU, United States, and other parts of the world. Therefore, I think working on that unity across the continent, but everything else starts here. If we should be able to increase trade among ourselves. As it sits, it's a very low compared to other parts of the world. We trade among ourselves in the range of 15, 20%. And the bulk of trade we do with the external players. I think there is need to realize and move forward among ourselves, train our people, ensure that we have the skills that is required to attract investors. We deal with conflict that is stopping investors coming to our continent. For us to be more attractive, we need to ensure that we really silence the guns.
Well, David, I hope we can keep talking about this. It's a very important conversation within our continent. Thank you so much for your time. It's always a pleasure speaking to you. That was David Monyae. He's director of the Center for Africa-China Studies at the University of Johannesburg.